personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a very special guest on the show today, Timothy Nobles. He's the Chief Commercial Officer at Integral. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
Well, I always love to talk to geeky tech people like me at geeky tech companies, and I love the stuff that you guys are doing around sensitive data and de-identification. But before we get started, why don't you tell me a little bit about your career trajectory and how you ended up being the Chief Commercial Officer at Integral?
Yeah, thank you. Super fun question in practice. I joke all the time that I started adult life as a professional rock and roller. So I was a bassist by trade, spent about 10 years on the road doing all of that. Somewhere along the way, I decided I should actually get a real job. That found me actually on a marketing track. And along the way, I used data extensively as part of the formula for success and the various marketing responsibilities I had. And along the way, I was forced to grapple with a little bit of the ethical concerns around it and what was I comfortable with, what was I not. And as I matured through my professional career, I definitely started to realize that, whoa, there's a pretty gratuitous abundance of data available on us, and I'm not really sure how I feel about that. And so about that same time is when I found my way into the healthcare side of my career. And that's when PHI and HIPAA and the idea of data compliance and privacy preservation and privacy enhancing techniques were really introduced. And that just became increasingly important to me overall. And along the way, I've had the opportunity as Chief Product Officer for a group called Trilliant Health, where we built a ton of very sophisticated predictive analytics, doing so in a compliant way that still gives you very high fidelity outputs and confidence in what the data itself is saying. And along the way, getting the data to a state of compliance actually ended up being one of those little things that really excited me. So when I ended up having the opportunity to connect with the founders of Integral, I pick on them all the time and say it was love at first sight. We were able to hit it off, and I really believed in what they were trying to accomplish, and I really appreciated the way in which they were trying to solve the problem. And so that brings us to here. I'm glad to unpack any of that. It feels appropriate.
Well, we have an international audience, so not everyone understands HIPAA or why it's challenging for us in the U.S., especially because the U.S., we don't have universal health care.
Yeah, good point.
So we have more challenges around this data portability and transferring data from one place to the next. But tell me, what is it about HIPAA that makes this data challenge unique?
HIPAA is a set of regulations that are really intended to protect the privacy of individuals. The genesis of it is really around the idea of preventing discrimination based on a health condition or whatever, but also just in overall protecting that of a patient's privacy in the US. From that, there's a very fuzzy set of outlines about what constitutes being in compliance with HIPAA. There's a few spirits under this. First, there's a methodology of data set preventing the risk of re-identification. And so these methodologies are referred to as expert determination or safe harbor. The big differentiation there is that expert determination is a statistical model and safe harbor is a redaction heavy model. And safe harbor, the easiest way to think about it is that if you just remove it, there's no risk of identification concern. It ends up being a pretty heavy and blunt instrument to a data set, moving immense fidelity and immense usefulness under the guise of care and treatment or support of improving outcomes for a patient. Expert determination being a statistical model, the goal there is basically to generate a non-zero probability of re-identification. In normal speak, that's how do you get that down to as close to a zero risk of re-identification as you possibly can, accepting that it being a statistical model, there's no way to purely get to zero. From that, the goal is to really make the data useful and portable in support of a concept we love to talk about based in Nashville. One of our favorite words is interoperability here. How do you make this data useful? How do you share it? How might you produce commercial value from the data without actually giving up an individual's privacy in so doing?
I think there are two challenges in HIPAA. One of it, you tell me whether I'm wrong or not. One is more of the statistical challenge. So people's data going into data sets in a statistical manner and trying to make sure we de-identify people in that way. Then also there's more of kind of the substantive matter of maybe redaction or trying to de-identify data sets where maybe it's diagnosis, some other qualitative information that is known about someone. So to me, those are different. But tell me, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really constructive question and one that is definitely chewy, for lack of a better way to put it. In practice, taking a statistical approach, one of the ways to think about it is you're trying to preserve as much fidelity within the data as possible. And so let's just use an ICD or a zip code. We'll actually reference both of those, right? And so statistically speaking, if you can produce a large enough aggregate or a large enough audience, depending upon how you might like to think about that, patient panel, within that, once it gets large enough, the ability to pinpoint an individual starts to go down. So for instance, on an ICD-10, which is diagnostic code to describe what a patient is dealing with, then that's a pretty high degree of fidelity in terms of what's going on. However, there's the idea of an ICD-3. So very similar to the way GPS coordinates work, the more digits you have behind the decimal, the higher the precision of that location. And the closer to the decimal point you get, the broader and broader and broader the radius becomes. It becomes increasingly difficult to pinpoint an individual. And so zip code's very much the same way as zip 9 versus an MSA or a CBSA geographic definition. So CBSA are statistical are core-based statistical areas, which is just a big, larger geographic definition. And so again, you're opening up the populations, getting bigger, and then the sensitivity to a condition or a disease type is lessening because you have more people who probably fit that criteria. Especially using an ICD-3, you'll have more people that ultimately aggregate into that. The other part of that, too, from a statistical point of view, is that you also have this idea of small cohorts. CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid here in the US, they have this notion of small cell size suppression, which is the small cohort thing. So they call it less than 11. Geographies have, typically you want to keep them north of 20 to 22,000 population. Said another way, it's very easy in some more rural parts of America that even the geography is really big. There are more cows than people. You have to make sure that you're always watching out for that. And so in some cases, there's just too few people, no matter how broad you get, in which case those just automatically become excluded. And then thankfully, at the data supplier side, there's very specific types of scenarios. Heaven forbid, a violent crime, terrible trauma-related event like an automobile accident, or things that have other publicly accessible data around them don't actually show in the data at all. That's typically not provided in the first place. So there's already some level of redaction on extremely sensitive matters like that.
Very good.
Okay, so then take the flip to your kind of redaction sentiment. So the goal there is that as you're aggregating, and I would kind of call it softening the edges a little bit, you're actually retaining a lot of fidelity and a lot of use in the data so that the data itself actually becomes descriptive. And so say you're trying to actually pursue a therapeutic design or something of that nature, the more fidelity you can have and the more you can understand about comorbidities, the more you can understand about environmental conditions, et cetera, around these populations, the more useful that becomes in the design of a therapeutic. And then when you kind of take the safe harbor approach, which is just go cut the data out, you end up with fragments, and there's a lot of holes and a lot of inferences that you end up having to make from a data analysis point of view. That could be very challenging. And they're also a lot easier to, I'm going to kind of stop short of saying get wrong, but it gets a lot easier to skew it and lose a lot of that core thread as a consequence of that data being removed.
Correct, right. Because you want to retain that usefulness, but you also want to protect the identities of the people for whom you're collecting that data.
Yeah. And so, for example, with HIPAA, sorry, you can't have first name, last name, social security, home address. None of that's admissible. That's all gone. There's really robust tokenization technology that's considered privacy preserving or in some cases privacy enhancing, where an individual has been obscured to this very complex token that's actually derived from a host of inputs, but it's so wildly obscured in even the same data set. If you purchased the same data set as I did, we would have different token sets on each of them. And so through that, very advanced technologies like that have helped bring this along so that the idea of longitudinal records can be better understood across multi-year patient care and treatment without ever getting at the ability to re-identify an individual.
So tell me what Integral does that's different from other people, other companies.
We really focus on the idea of compliance as a service. Historically, it's always been buy all this data, and then it's like, okay, I got to ship it off to the compliance side of the house, and it wanders around in the wilderness for, in some cases, and eventually you get it back, and a whole bunch of stuff's been asked to be taken out of the data set. And then you have all these remediations you have to go through. And so anywhere between 6 to 12 months later, you finally have a production data set that you can work with. The approach that we've taken is that through advanced algorithms and automations, we've been able to basically take that in, and within 24 hours, in most cases, there's a few exceptions to that, of course, but within most cases, about 24 hours, you've got the opportunity to look at what the top end privacy concerns are within the data. And within roughly 48 to 72 hours, you're actually looking at remediation recommendations. And the important thing there is that it's actually recommendations. It's not do this or else, which pretty much any consultant in the space, kind of takes a conservative posture, and rightfully so. I've personally purchased a number of those, and they're effective and they do exactly what you need them to do. But along the way, our founders and their experiences and my path in healthcare data is this really hopefully could become a more collaborative process, in which case we try to put that information face up and make it a conversation so that we can ensure that the compliance is, one, being held to the strictest standard, and then two, being as supportive as possible to the use cases of the customer.
I like that approach because I feel, I don't know what you think, but I think, especially with artificial intelligence, even though it's very helpful in data sets, sometimes it's more of like a machete than a scalpel. So I think that there has to be more conversation. What do you think?
Totally agree. Algorithms are, well, I'm just going to say computers, be a little bit more generalized. Computers are really brilliant at math and detection and classification. One of the really important things about what we do is we actually not only use the computer, but we also keep a human in the loop for us. So we have human certifiers that are checking our work and running in parallel with us. And so all of the certifications that we produce on behalf of our clients are both signed by us, Integral, as well as an expert certifier who will have a very deep background in biostats or something of that nature. Our head certifier is Dr. Bradley Malin, who's actually written a lot of the guidance on how to interpret HIPAA. So that helps a lot. And we constantly rely on them to help interrogate the results that we're producing, because computers are good at the science, people are really good at the art. You put those two things together and you have something quite powerful. Otherwise, to your point, the other thing, though, is that computers are kind of dumb and dutiful. I mean, even AI, while we support a lot of LLM, large language model data sets, we have a number of customers who have asked us to take unstructured data and run that through, get that compliant in such a way that the model development that they're doing is in zero risk of actually unintentionally inheriting something that is personally identifiable, or that through its development could produce ID data, which is really cool. And then that actually helps support some kind of early stage routing for healthcare. I mean, you're seeing a lot of this in the mental health domain. You're seeing a lot of this in on-call nurses here in the States where that approach is being taken. But I mean, to that point, these are still largely using math to guess what the next most probable thing is, which is genius in its own right. Don't take me wrong. But at the same time, the risk therein are really so much about the inputs associated with AI, more so than what AI is going to give you back. And so it's definitely one of those, your output in AI has so much to do with the input. And that's where we've taken a great deal of care to be able to support unstructured data pursuit of what inevitably is going to be lots and lots and lots and lots of AI development over time.
Yeah, I think the inputs are key. Unfortunately, some people think they have terrible data and they think somehow magically AI is going to make it better. It actually just creates more junk.
Yeah.
On the end. So making sure that the data is good before it goes into those models is really key.
I kind of liken it back to when Google really took ubiquity of search for pretty much everybody. And as a point of opinion, to me, it's really important that before you input something, also think about the context of what you're doing. Amongst many of my peers, we always joke about Dr. Google, the great symptom checker. But when you do that, like, you think about what Google actually knows and understands about you, especially if you're signed in using Chrome, it's a pretty high degree of fidelity about what they understand. And then if you're sitting there doing a search on a particular type of pain or trying to understand the condition of something, you inevitably are starting to just voluntarily give away PHI. While Google makes that easy and very transactional, and every once in a while when I stub my toe, I look at what are the symptoms of a broken toe, I'll do it myself. But at the same time, how can we think before we act when it comes to these models so that we're also taking active responsibility and making sure that we're not unnecessarily volunteering information, that through the terms of use, we are consenting to that information being used at scale by these other companies.
Yeah. I want your thoughts on two things that are happening, and I want you to definitely correct me if I'm wrong. But Obviously, there is personal health information that's collected about people that is derived outside of maybe a patient-provider relationship, so not a HIPAA. But then also a lot of privacy laws now in different US states and different locations around the world are calling for recommending that companies de-identify data sets. And so I think that's going to lead to more organizations leaning on people like Integral who understand the identification, even though it may not be HIPAA related. But what do you think about those two?
I think you're spot on. For our European friends, the GDPR set a really, my opinion, a very brilliant precedent for personal rights around data. Like any legislation and regulation anywhere, there's some things about it that are super strong and some things about it that are still kind of shaking it out as we go. What we've seen is a pretty significant amount of inspiration from that idea on the consumer side. So, California, Colorado, and other states enacting very similar definitions of a consumer and the notion of right to be forgotten, as well as extending into the territory of if health is concerned, how do we interpret that? Here in America, many of the states default to the HIPAA standard. However, there's some like Washington with the recent My Health, My Data Act, which is very thoughtful, very complicated, but it's very thoughtful act. But they've taken actually a considerably more conservative stance of what the definition of de-identification is than even HIPAA. With that, I definitely think that we're going to see a tendency to move towards these much broader definitions of de-identification. Thankfully, there seems to be a lot of the technology in place to be able to keep pace with that. I think businesses are going to have a very unique challenge if they manage, say, a national data set, which many of the commercial data providers have qualified that in America tend to run national sets of data that now, if the data is being used in these geographic territories like Washington State or California, Colorado, Vermont, fill in the blank, that what are the governance rules around that? And so I anticipate seeing a lot more focus on the structures of governance at a company level and the ability to showcase it through process and controls, in addition to the idea of the data at rest being considered compliant, but also mitigating the possibility of producing a data set that has a lesser definition of de-identification than Washington, that data going into Washington State, preventing those types of scenarios.
I think what you're describing is just the complexity that we have around data and trying to extrapolate what that means in terms of regulation in different jurisdictions. The US is almost like not 50 states, it's like 50 different countries. So
That's right.
It's really very challenging. It's very, very challenging. What is happening in the world right now that's concerning you, either about privacy or technology, health related or not? What do you think?
That's a lovely and loaded question. Yeah. I think that historically, in the world I live in, just the umbrella reach that a BAA or a business associates agreement, also known as a subcontractor agreement, has really held the industry together. It's this contractual handshake that, okay, it's cool for you to have this data at this high level of fidelity. So, for instance, potentially straight out of a health records management solution or straight out of a practice management solution, in which case you can share fully identified patient level data with someone. I think as these new regulations are coming on, a lot of that is actually being challenged very aggressively. And I'm not sure that we've quite come to terms with what we're going to do about that yet, which is good because it's time for that to ultimately update. I love a good BA, don't take me wrong. At the same time, HIPAA has the spirit of what's referred to as minimum necessary. And that means you don't give up any more data than is absolutely essential to do the job at hand. I think as these regulations come on, it's really bringing a little bit more attention to that idea of the minimum necessary. So do you have to have the whole data set in order to do this? Probably not. You probably need like 1/3 of it, maybe 1/2. So I think that that's going to end up being really interesting. And then I also think one of the other big challenges that we're facing is each state ultimately writing its own legislation around the language and then the scenarios that haven't been thought through yet. The California Act, for instance, there was this moment of, okay, well, is a physician a consumer? And thus, can you actually cite a physician as rendering care? The further into the states we get, the more the stuff will get ironed out. But there's still probably a good 5-year horizon, maybe more, as all of these unique exceptions or lack of clarity around what is or isn't the case associated with it and trying to get a voice to clarify that and set a standard or at least establish precedent is going to be something that's going to, at least in my opinion, probably cause a lot of thrashing along the way.
I agree with that. What we have outside of health are industries that are accustomed to collecting as much data as possible, indiscriminate data collection, and then really not understanding what has to be done to truly de-identify it. So just taking someone's name out or putting their last initial on something isn't sufficient.
No. Well, so actually, just to riff off of that, I think the other thing too is that we start looking at more AI agent based care. So again, I mean, just take mental health, for instance. Right? So voice is an identifier. Then you have all the phone level data and all these types of things that could be printed. And so I think there's going to ultimately also probably be some very very difficult decisions to make around what those data rights are and how much of that do you actually need to retain. And then in order to make the model, any model that you develop, you have to continuously help give it new information. But how can you do that with this unstructured data? And how and where can you use technologies that create a synthesized voice versus an actual voice that strip the idea of gender, strip the idea of identifiable attributes that can be found within a voice, or the same thing from, say, a video conference, telehealth conference. How might we be able to go create, actually use AI to go create synthetic composites of the patient to where, for training purposes or academic medical institutions being able to use this to help train future providers to where they can actually go and watch the encounters and learn what was happening and understand the inflections, but again, without actually portraying identity or personal attributes about an individual.
Yeah, I read an article that said that there's technology that exists. I don't know how well it works, but it said they can take a sample of someone's voice and tell certain health conditions that they may have just based on their voice.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know that personally, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, it's a wild, wild west in terms of AI and privacy. Where do you think we're going with AI? Obviously, AI has been around for quite some time. A lot of industries use it quite a bit, but I think when AI bursts out into public, I guess the public consciousness of it, we're seeing stuff from different ends of the spectrum. So one is the world's going to end in 2 years. I actually read that article came out because of artificial intelligence. And then the other is, oh, it's going to cure cancer. And it's like, no, it's not going to do that either. So what do you think about this wide spectrum or the conversation about artificial intelligence?
My dearest mother was a sci-fi nut. And so I got steeped in futuristic considerations and have a slight appetite for a dystopian bent. But with that, I think there's a little bit of truth in all of these things. Computers getting smarter is not Armageddon. It's not quite the Terminator narrative. But at the same time, it also solving world peace isn't necessarily true to the sensational headline as it is written. What we have seen is computers and algorithms, thus AI, have been getting increasingly good at helping, identify gene sequences and things that like can actually contribute to much faster breakthroughs in medical science. Now, has it replaced the human's ability to interpret that and actually sort out what that looks like? No, it'll be a long while yet. But does it mean that it will end up being an increasingly kind of a creative assistant to those professionals? Absolutely. And so I think that's actually where the blend of this sits, is that it's okay for us to be a little bit shocked by it. A dear friend of mine always made the joke of, oh, Facebook changed the color of the button. We all hate Facebook now. And if something changed just a little bit different, thus we all hate it, give it a couple of weeks, we'll all get okay with it. And so right now, it feels like we're going through one of those moments of there's change afoot and we don't really know what to do with it yet. But if we spend a little bit of time with it, we'll realize where and how it can be of use to us. And I mean, at the moment, the goal is really probably for it to be more assistive. And there are tons of things that we can use to unburden ourselves, tactically speaking, do little mundane chores and things. As an example, I use one to help build homework schedules at my house. It's like, all right, what was the day? Here's the time. Like, let's go build it out. And the crew loves that. It's really fun. Technology's in there helping. So that helps us get done something that before might have taken 20 minutes and now we're done in like 3. And that's great. That's cool. But does that mean it is going to go do all the homework for us and all of that? No, not yet. Yeah, I could go on for an hour about this, but I'll stop there.
Well, it's fascinating. I love your thoughts there. I'm totally just really thinking about a lot of companies that have data right now. Maybe they are concerned or afraid to be able to use certain data because they're concerned about being able to do it in such a way that they're not running afoul of certain legislation, but they really want to take a stab at de-identification to see if that's something, because we know that if a data set is sufficiently de-identified within certain regulations, it will be easier for them to do that data sharing. But so how would you talk to someone about that from a business case level?
Yeah. So one of the things that we really think about a lot is this idea of chain of custody or data providence, however you like to think about it. And so part of the way we've designed our solution is to actually be one of the transport rails. So how do you get it from the source to the customer's infrastructure, data storage? And so meaning that we've really taken an approach where we're trying to help you to pick up. We can do all the compliance and the remediation and the pipe to where by the time you take receipt of it, you're already in a good way relative to the regulation. And so part of why we've taken that approach is really the exact spirit of what you're getting at, is that there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of intricacy, and there's also a lot of liability associated with that. And most executives are tasked with trying to figure out how to grow the business, not go solve all these little minute details about, oh, Nebraska's issued something new today. So like, what the heck? What does that mean? Oh, we'll handle that. But the idea of compliance as a service is about putting it in with the flow of the data. So as silly as it might sound, it's really not a whole lot different than chain of custody on a gallon of milk. The second it leaves the dairy to getting into the cooler at the local market, the integrity of that trip is very important, because every degree of temperature the milk might lose is actually days off the expiration. And so the quality of the product is decaying very fast. And so our goal is to be able to pick this up, get it to you as quickly as possible in a compliant manner so that your teams can act on it as quickly as possible in service of the business or strategic intent.
Also, I think one thing that's happening, and this is something that you all help with, which I'm glad you do this as a service, is that a lot of people don't have the skill in-house to be able to do this. So even if they have this task they have to do, it's hard to have someone do it who does not have the training or expertise in it. What do you think?
That's exactly right. And also, if you think about an overall legal perspective, a broad privacy perspective, there's a lot of value in having an objective party look at it. Because really, at the end of the day, so long as it's ethical, we don't really have a specific concern on what the data itself is. We have a concern on whether or not it's satisfactorily de-identified and in support of the use case the customer's in pursuit of. And so with that, to your point, there's not a whole ton of people floating around the globe that actually have the qualifications and the interest and the willingness to go tackle these types of problems. And so typically what you find is there's a group of academics and then some very specific, very high level biostatisticians or statisticians who love this kind of stuff. And again, you're dealing with a very rare community around the globe. And on top of that, a lot of times from an enterprise perspective, there's not actually a reason to try to own that resource. They're costly. Really, at the end of the day, their outputs could very easily be considered as potentially contentious, whereas we have, those of us in the space that focus on the idea of compliance, we have the ability to come back and deliver that news, but we can deliver it in such a way that we just need to make sure you understand where these risks are and what this is and what this is. And now let's go make the right decision in service of the best data possible while maintaining the strictest of compliance.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the right approach. And I foresee definitely more people going this route, even if they don't have HIPAA concerns, because they really don't truly know how to do the identification.
Yeah, and I mean, to your exact point, just as consumer rights get increasingly strict, finance around the world is another really great example. I mean, they have very similar in spirit types of compliance frameworks, and we're going to see ultimately more and more and more of this over time. Your point's exactly that at the end of the day, corporate responsibility is going to be really about protecting their customers. And part of that isn't always having their full identity floating around 50 different places or hundreds of different places. It's going to be this idea of data responsibility and ethics around that. And then I hope, me selfishly, I hope to see considerable increases in transparency from companies about how our data as individuals and consumers are actually being used. What is that actually supporting for their business? And I mean, we're starting to see that in some slightly more bespoke and digital forward businesses, which are also starting to see larger brands as well start to take a little bit more of that responsibility. And I hope that becomes considerably more pervasive versus we hit the accept the cookie button. Well, how long before the brokers have that? And it's within seconds that information is being sold off somewhere. Hopefully we can get to where that's a much more transparent process.
Yeah, I agree. I was actually quoted in an article in Legal Tech News not long ago, And the reporter was asking me about anonymization and de-identification. So I guess some big brand, I can't remember, some really big one, I can't remember, said, oh, well, don't worry about the data you give us because it's like de-identified or anonymized. I'm like, well, what does that mean exactly?
Do tell.
To your point about transparency, like that can mean 1,000 different things. So what does that mean exactly? So yeah, I agree what you say that it does need to be more transparent. But how do you think it should be more transparent?
Well, I mean, I think very thankfully, oddly enough, I think this is where regulation could be a friend as the regulations go along. And the certifications, not much different than being a B Corp or other types of environmental green standards, which there's an ever-growing collection of those. There's all sorts of ways in which there are governing third-party bodies, let's just say, that can say, hey, you're abiding by these standards, and these are the behaviors that you are consistently demonstrating with respect to a topic. How can an expert determination report, for instance, serve as one of those? And the fact that you can comply across all of these states. Yes, that does put a little bit more work on a corporation, but at the same time, relative to the value that could earn them, that's a very minuscule moment of effort relative to the value that produces and very likely the loyalty of customer that would produce. And how all that shakes out yet, I don't know. Honestly, I haven't really thought that far ahead, but I do think that there are existing frameworks that we could reference to how could a business approach saying, no, we're ahead of this. We care about you. These are the things that we're doing. And in plain English, in our terms of use, this is what this means.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. So if it were the world according to you, Timothy, and we did everything you said, what would be your wish for privacy anywhere in the world, whether that be regulation, human behavior, or technology?
Oh, so fun. I think in general, and as I say this, I have zero idea how to actually pull this off, but I think it'd be really great for us to be able to have direct control and access over all of our data. And it'd be so simple as the little toggles, like what we're used to on our, phones, like what where and how could we have that level of granular control, right? So if we sit down to watch a program on Netflix, no, I don't want Netflix to know. If I want to go buy ice cream, then sure, I don't care if anybody knows I like ice cream, but like be able to participate in those decisions. And kind of along the same lines, I would love to see the idea of how consent-based participation around data could activate a lot of use cases that don't exist right now. And what kind of one of my pie in the sky ones would be, what would it mean, especially in America with a commercial payer, like a United Health, et cetera? What would it mean if a patient were to consent to allowing their data holistically to be used, de-identified, but be used for premium offsets, meaning that could you actually get a plan for free to where instead of paying this monthly premium, you actually now have money to go seek care. But to you, that exchange was worth it to be able to say, cool, you can have my grocery shopping data, but no secrets, sure. And then meanwhile, that gave me back whatever, several $100s a month, to actually seek care and pursue that healthier lifestyle to where I'm not showing up in emergency departments with high acuity situations.
I never thought about that. That would be interesting. That would be interesting. So thank you so much for being on the show. This is great. I love this conversation, and I'm sure a lot of people be thinking more about this as they start to really dig into a lot of these state regulations and also internationally when we're thinking about the identification and trying to actually use data in ways to actually protect humans.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you so much, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.